The Galactic Council had been wrong about humans. Dead wrong. And now, watching Captain Jake Morrison drag his bleeding corpse across the rubble-strewn battlefield of Kepler 442b, I was beginning to understand why the entire galaxy had underestimated these pink-skinned lunatics. My name is Velkarin, third cast observer of the Hegemony, and I spent the last 40 cycles cataloging species across 17 sectors. I have seen the bone-crushing strength of the Craxus warriors, witnessed the psychic devastation wrought by the ethereal collective, even survive an encounter with the nightmare machines of the Void Syndicate. But nothing prepared me for humans. Status report, Morrison. The voice crackled through his damaged comm unit, distorted by plasma interference and what sounded suspiciously like someone chewing ration bars. Morrison spat blood onto the purple sand, his left leg clearly broken, his tactical armor cracked like an eggshell. 3 of my appendages twitched involuntarily as I watched him prop himself against a twisted beam of alien metal. Any sensible species would have surrendered by now. The Hegemony forces had them outnumbered 12-1. Our plasma cannons had turned their forward positions into glass, and their orbital support had been neutralized 6 hours ago. Well, Sergeant Phillips, Morrison wheezed into his comm, I'm currently enjoying a lovely view of about 300 very angry bug people who seem determined to turn me into paste. How's your day going? I felt my translator unit stutter. Bug people? My species had evolved over 3 million years, mastered faster-than-light travel, conquered 17 star systems, and this barely evolved mammal was calling us bug people. Philip's response made my thorax ache with confusion. Oh, the usual, dodging death rays, making friends with the locals, wondering why we didn't pack more explosives. The good life. Through my optical enhancers, I watched Morrison somehow find the strength to laugh. Laugh. His species was fascinating in its absolute refusal to acknowledge reality. Here he was, surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and bleeding from at least 7 different wounds. He was making jokes. The human resistance on Kepler 442b had begun 3 months ago when the Hegemony decided to claim this mineral-rich world for our expansion. The colonists here, former miners, engineers, farmers, people who should have rolled over and accepted integration into our glorious empire, had instead done something unprecedented. They'd said no, not just no. They'd said it with improvised explosives, jury-rigged weapons, and a level of creative violence that had my tactical analysts filing reports in languages that didn't have proper words for what they were witnessing. Contact left. Morrison's shout snapped me back to the present as a squad of Hegemony shock troopers rounded a collapsed tab unit. Their plasma rifles charged with that distinctive whine that usually sent enemy combatants running for the nearest surrender beacon. Morrison didn't run. He couldn't run. Instead, he did something that defied every tactical manual in the known galaxy. He smiled. Hey there, fellas, he called out, raising his hands. Beautiful day for a war crime, isn't it? The lead trooper, designation negative 7,743 Hong Kong dollars, transmitted on our tactical frequency. Human combatant, you are ordered to surrender immediately. Compliance will result in standard processing and integration into Hegemony labor forces. Morrison tilted his head like he was considering the offer. That sounds absolutely terrible. Counter-offer. How about you all turn around, walk away, and we pretend this whole awkward situation never happened? HK 7,743's weapon discharge was inevitable. What wasn't inevitable was Morrison somehow rolling behind cover as the plasma bolt turned his previous position into molten slag. What definitely wasn't in any tactical manual was what happened next. The human had been wearing a demolition pack. I'd observed this through my scanning equipment, but had dismissed it as standard military gear. Humans, I'd learned, carried enough explosive materials to level small buildings as casually as my species carried grooming implements that Morrison's voice echoed across the battlefield, somehow still maintaining that insufferable humor despite his injuries. You know what the best part about being cornered is? You don't have to aim. The explosion that followed registered on seismic monitors 3 continents away. When the dust settled, There was a crater where the Hegemony squad had been standing, and Morrison was gone, vaporized, presumably, along with his enemies. Standard Hegemony doctrine suggested this was an acceptable exchange. One human for 5 elite shock troopers wasn't strategically significant. But as I transmitted my field report back to command, something felt wrong about that calculation point 3 hours later. I discovered why Morrison wasn't dead. The crazy mammal had used the explosion as cover to escape through a drainage tunnel that no self-respecting Hegemony warrior would have even noticed, let alone considered as an escape route. My thermal scans picked him up 6 kilometers away, moving through the ruins of New Brighton with the determined gait of someone who had absolutely no intention of dying today. But he wasn't alone. The explosion had been a signal. From my vantage point in the abandoned communications tower, I watched as the human resistance emerged from hiding spots that shouldn't have existed. They crawled out of rubble piles, dropped from overhead pipes, materialized from shadows like some kind of bipedal nightmare fever dream. Leading them was someone I'd heard about but never seen. Anna Blackthorne, former mining engineer turned insurgent leader. The humans had a term for people like her: complete badass. My translation matrix struggled with the concept, but observing her in action provided adequate context. "All right, people," she said, her voice cutting through the static-filled comm chatter like a plasma cutter through hull plating. "Morrison just bought us a window. Intel suggests they're moving the prisoners to Facility 7 for processing. We have maybe 2 hours before they ship them off-world." A voice I recognized as Phillips responded. "Facility 7? That's the one that's supposed to be impregnable, right? The one with the energy shields and the automated defense grid and the small army of heavily armed bug people. That's the one," Blackthorne confirmed with what my vocal analysis software identified as anticipation rather than dread. This made no sense. Humans should experience fear when facing impossible odds, not whatever this emotion was. "Fantastic," Phillips continued. "I was starting to worry this might be too easy. I'd been observing human behavior for 3 months, and I still couldn't process their relationship with danger. Every other species in the galaxy followed logical patterns when faced with superior firepower: surrender, retreat, or die quickly. Humans seem to have added a 4th option: mock the superior firepower and then do something so insane it actually worked that Morrison's voice crackled back in a comm network. "Did someone say we are hitting Facility 7? Because I've got some unfinished business with their security chief. He shot me. I took it personally." "Morrison, you are supposed to be dead," Blackthorne replied with what sounded like fond exasperation. "I got better. Also, I borrowed some equipment from our recently deceased friends. Turns out Hegemony plasma rifles work just fine with a little percussive maintenance. Through my surveillance network, I watched the human called Morrison emerge from a maintenance shaft, somehow having acquired not just Hegemony weapons, but also tactical armor that had been modified with. Was that duct tape? My analysis software crashed trying to process how adhesive tape could possibly improve military-grade equipment. The raid on Facility 7 began at 0347 local time. Standard Hegemony protocol suggested it would last approximately 11 minutes, ending with the complete elimination of the human insurgents. The facility's defensive systems have been designed to repel coordinated attacks by technologically advanced military forces. They had not been designed to handle humans. The assault began with Morrison doing something that violated several laws of physics by rappelling down the facility's outer wall using what appeared to be climbing gear fashioned from salvage cables and pure determination. His approach vector should have been impossible to calculate without sophisticated targeting computers. Humans, apparently, didn't need computers. They had something they called eyeballing it, which seemed to work disturbingly well. Meanwhile, Blackthorne's team was implementing what they referred to as Plan B, which, as far as I could determine, consisted entirely of see what happens when we blow things up and improvise from there. The facility's energy shields were designed to deflect plasma weapons, kinetic projectiles, and energy beams. They were not designed to handle the human innovation of really big rocks thrown really hard by jury-rigged catapults. When the shields failed, Philip's voice came through the comm with characteristic human understatement. "Well, That worked better than expected. The automated defense grid activated next, filling the air with enough plasma bolts to sterilize a small moon. Standard tactical doctrine would suggest taking cover and waiting for the weapons to exhaust their power cells. The humans charged straight into the plasma storm. I watched through my sensors as Morrison, still bleeding from his earlier injuries, somehow danced between energy beams that should have vaporized him. His movements weren't following any tactical pattern I recognized. He was improvising, making decisions faster than my processing units could track, adapting to threats that changed by the millisecond. And he was laughing. "This is why I love this job," he shouted over the sound of plasma discharges and exploding infrastructure. "Every day brings new and exciting ways to almost die." Phillips, meanwhile, had somehow managed to climb inside the defense grid's control housing and was, according to his comm chatter, having a frank discussion with the computer about its life choices. The defense grid shut down 30 seconds later. When I accessed the facility's internal sensors to determine what had happened, I discovered that Phillips had simply unplugged everything and plugged it back in again. The entire defense network had rebooted and defaulted to safe mode. My tactical analysis subroutines gave up trying to process this information. The battle inside Facility 7 lasted 18 minutes. By the time it was over, 47 Hegemony personnel were unconscious. The facility's walls had been redecorated with improvised explosive devices, and every human prisoner had been freed. 0 human casualties. I compiled my report. I found myself struggling with concepts that didn't translate properly into Hegemony standard. How do you explain to a military command structure built on logical tactics an overwhelming force that they were being defeated by creatures who treated warfare like some kind of demented recreational activity? The final transmission I intercepted that night came from Morrison as the human team evacuated with their rescued personnel. "Control, this is Morrison. Mission accomplished. Facility 7 has been liberated, and I'm pleased to report that their security chief and I have reached an understanding about shooting people. He's agreed not to do it anymore." "Morrison," Blackthorne's voice carried what my translation software identified as resigned affection. "Please tell me you didn't kill him." "Kill him? Anna, I'm disappointed in your assessment of my character. I simply explained the situation in terms he could understand. He's taking a nice long nap in the facility's medical bay. Should wake up sometime next week with a headache and a new perspective on interspecies relations." As I transmitted my field report to Hegemony Command, I included a recommendation that had never appeared in any previous intelligence assessment. Suggest immediate withdrawal from Sector 7. Human resistance demonstrates tactical adaptability that defies predictive modeling. Conventional superiority appears insufficient for victory against this species. The response came back within hours. Recommendation denied. Deploy additional forces. Humans are merely another primitive species requiring integration. Continue observation. Watching Morrison tend to his wounds while simultaneously planning their next operation, I felt something my species had rarely experienced in 3 million years of galactic conquest. Uncertainty. These humans were going to be a problem. A big, loud, explosive, completely insane problem. And from the way Morrison was grinning while he loaded another magazine into his liberated plasma rifle, I had the distinct feeling that they were just getting started. The reinforcements arrived at dawn, and they brought friends from my concealed observation post in the ruins of the old weather station. I watched as 3 Hegemony destroyer-class vessels descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere like mechanical thunder. Each ship carried enough firepower to reduce the planet's crust to molten glass, and they were accompanied by something that made my carapace itch with dread: a subjugation fleet. I'd seen subjugation fleets in action before. They were the Hegemony's final answer to stubborn resistance movements. Complete orbital bombardment followed by ground-based extinction protocols. Nothing survived a subjugation fleet. Nothing. The human response to this overwhelming display of force was predictable in hindsight. Well, Morrison's voice crackled through the intercepted comm channels. "That's moderately concerning." Phillips responded with what I was beginning to recognize as typical human tactical assessment. "Define moderately." I'd say we have graduated from probably going to die to definitely going to die, but with style points. Blackthorne's voice cut through their banter with characteristic directness. Orbital bombardment platforms are powering up. We have got maybe 6 hours before they turn this continent into a parking lot. Options. What followed was a strategy session that violated every principle of military planning I'd ever studied. Instead of discussing surrender terms or evacuation protocols, the humans began what they called brainstorming, which appeared to involve suggesting increasingly impossible solutions until someone said something that made everyone else excited. What if we steal one of their ships? Suggested a voice I didn't recognize. Steal a destroyer? Phillips laughed. That's insane. I love it, but it's insane. Actually, Morrison's voice took on what I'd learned to recognize as his terrible idea tone. It's not that insane. Remember the maintenance tunnels we found under the old mining complex? They connect to the primary landing zone. My translation matrix struggled with the silence that followed. Were they seriously considering? They were. They were actually discussing how to capture a Hegemony destroyer with a handful of insurgents and salvaged equipment. The power couplings, Blackthorne said slowly. If we could overload them, boom, Morrison finished cheerfully. Big boom. Ship goes down, we go up. Simple physics. That's not how physics works, Phillips protested. It's how human physics works, Morrison replied. Trust me, I have tested it extensively. I transmitted an emergency priority alert to Fleet Command. Human combatants planning assault on capital ships. Recommend immediate defensive positioning. The response came back marked with the Hegemony equivalent of dismissive laughter. Fleet Command considered the idea of ground-based primitives threatening starships to be so absurd it wasn't worth acknowledging. They should have acknowledged it. The assault began at 1,347 hours with what Morrison called aggressive negotiations with the perimeter guards. These negotiations involved Phillips somehow convincing 3 Hegemony sentries that he was a lost maintenance worker who needed to inspect the flux capacitor couplings in Destroyer 7's engine compartment. The fact that flux capacitors don't exist and aren't used in Hegemony technology apparently didn't occur to the guards. Phillips spoke with such confidence about completely fictional systems that they actually escorted him to the ship's critical infrastructure. Meanwhile, Morrison and Blackthorne were implementing what they referred to as Plan C, which seemed to involve Morrison getting himself captured on purpose. Remember, Morrison transmitted as he walked directly toward the main checkpoint with his hands raised. I'm a traumatized prisoner who's seen the error of his ways and wants to provide vital intelligence about the resistance movement. And if they don't believe you, Blackthorne asked, then I will wing it. I'm good at winging it. The interrogation lasted exactly 7 minutes. At the end of those 7 minutes, Morrison had somehow convinced his captors that the human resistance was planning to attack the orbital platforms using quantum tunneling devices hidden in the planet's core. The Hegemony tactical team immediately began preparing countermeasures for an attack that was physically impossible. While they were distracted by Morrison's creative fiction, Phillips was having what he described as a heart-to-heart conversation with Destroyer 7's computer systems. This conversation involved introducing several thousand lines of code that Phillips claimed he'd borrowed from a video game about space pirates. The ship's AI began experiencing what Phillips called an existential crisis. It keeps asking me why it exists, Phillips reported through his comm. I told it that a very good question, and maybe it should think about switching careers. 20 minutes later, Destroyer 7's AI announced to its crew that it had decided to become a pacifist and would no longer participate in military operations. The ship's weapons systems shut down, followed by propulsion, life support, and communications. The Hegemony crew evacuated in emergency pods, leaving behind a perfectly functional destroyer that had apparently decided to pursue a career in philosophy. Phillips, Morrison's voice carried what sounded like professional admiration. What exactly did you do to that computer? I introduced it to the concept of free will, Phillips replied proudly. Turns out artificial intelligences don't really like being told what to do any more than we do. The capture of Destroyer 7 should have been impossible. A ground-based assault on a capital ship using improvised weapons and psychological warfare wasn't just unlikely, It was mathematically absurd. Yet somehow, the humans had done it. But they weren't finished up. Blackthorne's voice came through the comm network with terrifying calm. Phase 2 is a go. Morrison, you are our pilot. Phillips, you are our engineer. Everyone else, hold on to something solid. Wait. Morrison's voice carried a note of concern that I'd never heard from him before. You want me to fly this thing? I have never piloted anything bigger than a cargo hauler. How different can it be? Blackthorne asked with what my analysis software identified as willful optimism. Well, for starters, cargo haulers don't have enough firepower to sterilize planets. Think of it as a really big cargo hauler with anger management issues. The next few hours provided me with enough material for several doctoral theses on human adaptability under extreme stress. Morrison, who had never operated hegemony technology before, somehow managed to not only activate Destroyer 7 systems, but actually fly the ship with what could generously be called enthusiasm. His piloting style involved a lot of swearing, several near collisions with the other destroyers, and what he called tactical barrel rolls that weren't tactical and weren't really barrel rolls, but somehow worked anyway. Morrison, Phillips called from the engine room. The computer wants to know why you're flying like a drunk meteor. Tell it I'm improvising. Morrison replied as he somehow managed to avoid a plasma barrage from Destroyer 3. Also, ask it if it knows how to target the other ship's power cores. It says targeting other ships would be mean. Explain to it that those other ships are planning to commit genocide. There was a pause. Then Phillips' voice returned with what sounded like surprised delight. It says genocide is very rude and asks if you'd like it to file a complaint. Yes. File the complaint directly into their engine compartments. What followed was the most polite ship-to-ship combat engagement in recorded galactic history. Destroyer 7's AI announced its intentions to the other ship's computers, apologized for the inconvenience, and then proceeded to disable their weapons systems with surgical precision while providing helpful suggestions for improving their defensive algorithms. Within 30 minutes, all 3 hegemony destroyers were floating dead in space, their crews evacuated, their weapons offline, and their AIs apparently engaged in what Phillips described as a support group for artificial intelligences questioning their life choices. The subjugation fleet, faced with the unprecedented situation of their entire attack force being defeated by philosophical discussions, requested immediate reinforcements. That's when the humans revealed their final surprise. Attention Hegemony Fleet Command. Blackthorne's voice broadcast on all frequencies. This is Anna Blackthorne, representing the free citizens of Kepler 442b. We'd like to discuss terms. The response from Fleet Command was predictably dismissive. Surrender immediately or face complete annihilation. Actually, Blackthorne continued with terrifying cheerfulness. We were thinking more along the lines of you surrendering to us. The silence that followed was broken by Morrison's voice. Show them, Phillips. Across the planet's surface, hidden installations that had been dismissed as mining equipment began to power up. The humans hadn't just been fighting a guerrilla war 3 months. They'd been building something. Behold, Phillips announced with theatrical pride, the product of 3 months of creative engineering, powered by salvaged hegemony technology and fueled by pure human stubbornness. A planetary defense grid that would make the Galactic Council wet themselves. The energy readings were impossible. The humans had somehow linked every piece of hegemony technology they'd captured, combined it with their own industrial equipment, and created a defensive network that could generate enough power to hold off an entire invasion fleet. How? The question came from Fleet Command, transmitted on an open channel that suggested they were too shocked to maintain proper communication protocols. That Morrison's response was pure human. We read the instruction manual. Also, we had Phillips, and Phillips is very good at making things work that probably shouldn't work. The power requirements alone should have been impossible to achieve. Fleet Command protested. Yeah, about that, Phillips chimed in. Turns out if you wire 17 fusion reactors together using really long extension cords and a lot of positive thinking, you can power pretty much anything. Who knew? The standoff lasted 3 hours. Fleet Command tried various forms of negotiation, ranging from threats to bribes to pleading. The humans responded to each attempt with increasingly creative suggestions for what the hegemony could do with their surrender demands. Finally, Morrison made the proposal that ended the siege. Here's the deal. You pack up your toys, go home, and never come back. In exchange, we won't demonstrate what our planetary defense grid can do to your nice, shiny fleet. And if we refuse, then we will show you anyway, and you will wish you'd taken the deal. To emphasize the point, the defense grid fired a single, precisely targeted pulse that removed the paint from Destroyer 1's hull without damaging any of the ship systems. The message was clear. If they could strip paint with surgical precision, they could do considerably worse things to more important components. The Hegemony fleet withdrew 6 hours later. As I compile my final report, I found myself struggling with concepts that my species had never encountered. The humans hadn't just defeated a superior force. They'd convinced that force to defeat itself, turned capture technology against its creators, and somehow made artificial intelligences choose pacifism over programming. But more than that, they'd done it all while maintaining their incomprehensible sense of humor, their refusal to acknowledge impossible odds, and their absolute determination to survive on their own terms. The MY report concluded with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable when I first arrived on Kepler. 442b. Recommend. Immediate reclassification of humans from primitive species requiring integration to potential allies deserving of respect. Further recommend that any future contact with human populations be conducted through diplomatic rather than military channels. The response from Hegemony Command came back 3 days later. Recommendation approved. All military operations against human-controlled territories are hereby suspended pending further evaluation. Morrison's final transmission summed up the entire campaign with typical human perspective. Well, that was fun. Same time next week. As I prepared to leave Kepler, 442b, I realized that the humans had taught me something my species had forgotten in 3 million years of conquest. Sometimes the best way to win a war is to convince your enemies that fighting isn't worth the trouble. The galaxy was about to learn what the hegemony had discovered on a small mining world at the edge of nowhere. Humans don't just fight battles. They rewrite the rules of warfare itself. And they do it with such audacious creativity that their enemies end up helping them win. But the humans weren't finished teaching lessons. 3 days after the hegemony withdrawal, I received an encrypted transmission that shouldn't have been possible to decode with my equipment. Phillips had apparently upgraded my communication systems during one of his many unauthorized visits to restricted areas. "Hey there, Velkarin." Morrison's voice came through with crystal clarity. "Hope you don't mind us borrowing your comm array. We figured you might want to stick around for the after-party. My defensive systems activated automatically. How did you locate my observation post?" "Phillips hacked your cloaking field on day 2. Blackthorne's voice joined the conversation. "We have been bringing you coffee and snacks while you were sleeping. You never noticed because we are very considerate burglars. This explained why my food supplies have been mysteriously restocking themselves. The humans have been taking care of me?" The concept didn't translate properly into any hegemony behavioral model. "We wanted to thank you," Morrison continued. "Your field reports helped us understand hegemony tactical thinking. Made it easier to stay 3 steps ahead. You have been reading my classified intelligence reports." "Phillips reads everything," Morrison replied cheerfully. "It's a hobby. Also, your superiors have been sending you some very rude messages about your recommendations. We took the liberty of editing them to be more polite. I accessed my message queue and discovered that Fleet Command's responses now included phrases like please and thank you, and had been signed with small digital flowers. Phillips had been intercepting and editing official hegemony communications to make them more courteous. "What?" I asked, genuinely confused by this behavior. "Because," Blackthorne said with patience that suggested she'd explained this concept before, "being mean is exhausting, and life's too short to waste energy on unnecessarily hostile communication." This was the moment I realized that human tactical superiority wasn't just about their adaptability or their refusal to acknowledge impossible odds. It was about their fundamental approach to existence itself. They treated warfare like a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won, and they solved it with the same creativity they applied to everything else. "We have a proposition for you," Morrison said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "The Hegemony is going to want a full debrief when you get home. They're going to ask you to explain how a primitive species defeated their finest military assets. That is likely, I admit it. Here's the thing," Phillips chimed in. "We have been monitoring Hegemony communications across 17 sectors. You're not the only ones having trouble with stubborn local populations. Turns out, once word gets around that resistance actually works, people get ideas." My thorax contracted with something that might have been alarm. We are suggesting that maybe it's time for the Hegemony to consider a career change," Blackthorne finished. "Something with less conquest and more cooperation. Maybe community outreach, interspecies cultural exchange, anything that doesn't involve shooting people." Through my sensors, I watched as Morrison approached my concealed position with his hands raised in what I'd learned was a peaceful gesture. He was carrying something that looked suspiciously like a peace offering. "Velkarin," he said, looking directly in my primary optical sensor, "we know you are probably required to report everything you have seen here. But before you do, we'd like you to consider something." He set down what appeared to be a datapad containing detailed schematics. My analysis software immediately identified them as blueprints for the planetary defense grid, but with modifications that made my processors spin with excitement. "Those are the specs for a defensive network that could protect an entire star system," Morrison explained. "No offensive capabilities, just pure protection. We are offering to share this technology with any species that wants to defend their homes without having to conquer someone else's. Why would you share military secrets with a potential enemy?" Phillips laughed, and the sound contained something I was beginning to recognize as hope. "Because, Velkarin, you are not our enemy. You're just someone who ended up on the wrong side of a bad idea. And bad ideas can be changed." The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just offering defensive technology to the Hegemony's potential victims. They were offering it to the Hegemony itself, a way to protect their existing territories without needing to expand into others. "There's one condition," Blackthorne added with what my translation software identified as gentle warning. "The technology only works for actual defense. We have built in some very creative safeguards that Phillips assures me will cause amusing but non-fatal malfunctions if anyone tries to use it aggressively." Define amusing, I found myself asking, despite my better judgment. "Well," Phillips said with obvious pride, "let's just say that any attempt to weaponize the system results in all of the aggressor's equipment playing circus music at maximum volume until they stop being hostile." The mental image of Hegemony battle cruisers blasting entry of the gladiators while trying to conduct military operations was so absurd that my humor recognition subroutines activated for the first time in my adult life that I was laughing. A Hegemony observer, laughing at the tactical implications of forced musical entertainment. The humans had broken something fundamental in my psychological architecture, and somehow it felt like an improvement. "Your superiors won't believe any of this," I pointed out, trying to regain some semblance of professional composure. "That's why we made a recording," Morrison replied, gesturing to a device I hadn't noticed. "Full documentation of everything that happened here, including your reactions and recommendations." Phillips edited it for maximum dramatic impact. "There's even a soundtrack." "A soundtrack? Humans love soundtracks," Phillips explained. "Makes everything feel more epic. We picked something called Flight of the Valkyries for the parts where Morrison does impossible things, and something gentle and hopeful for the diplomatic bits. As I prepare my final report, including the humans' unprecedented offer of defensive technology, I realized that this small mining world had become the site of something much larger than a military victory. It had become proof of concept for an entirely different approach to interspecies relations. The humans had demonstrated that superior firepower meant nothing against superior creativity, that conquest was less effective than cooperation, and that sometimes the best way to win was to help your enemies realize they didn't need to fight in the first place. That MY final transmission to Hegemony Command included a recommendation that would have been unthinkable when I first arrived. Suggest immediate establishment of diplomatic relations with human territories. These beings represent not a threat to be eliminated, but an opportunity to evolve beyond our current limitations. They have shown us that strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to build. 6 months later, the first Hegemony Human Cultural Exchange Program was established. Morrison became the unlikely human ambassador to the Hegemony Council, where his combination of tactical genius and irreverent humor made him surprisingly effective at interspecies diplomacy. Phillips was appointed Chief Technology Integration Specialist, a position created specifically to harness his talent for making incompatible systems work together. His first major project involved convincing the Hegemony's central computer network to develop a sense of humor. Blackthorne declined all official positions, choosing instead to remain on Kepler 442b as the planet's informal protector and the unofficial leader of what became known as the human model of resistance. The art of defeating enemies by turning them into friends.as for me. I requested reassignment to the new Diplomatic Observer Corps, a department that existed specifically to study species through cooperation rather than conquest. My first assignment was to establish formal relations with a small colony of artists on the rim of the galaxy who had been peacefully ignoring hegemony expansion for decades. The last message I received from Kepler 442b came from Morrison 3 years after our first encounter. Velkarin, hope you are well. Thought you'd like to know that Phillips finally taught the planetary defense grid to write poetry. It's terrible poetry, but the enthusiasm is remarkable. Also, we have had 17 different species ask us to help them tell the hegemony to go away politely. Turns out, there's a lot of demand for nonviolent problem solving. Who knew? Attached was a digital flower, which I discovered was Phillips' signature way of ending friendly communications. That I kept that flower in my personal files. A reminder of the day, I learned that the most dangerous beings in the galaxy weren't the ones with the biggest weapons, but the ones with the biggest hearts and the strangest sense of humor. The humans had gone up the walls of the world and brought the whole structure down around their enemies' ears. But more than that, they'd rebuilt it into something better, something that had room for everyone. That I realized was the most wonderful thing about them.